Lesson 5: Thinking in terms of stocks and flows. In this lesson, we will understand the importance of knowing stocks and flows in our system. We will also talk about the benefits of thinking in terms of stocks and flows and how this kind of thinking will allow us to identify where are possible points of interventions later on. In the previous lessons, we explored the idea of defining causal relationships in our systems. We applied a technique called causal loop mapping, and the goal is to be able to identify the relationships between these variables in our systems. In this lesson, we will now want to go deeper into understanding the nature of these variables by associating them to the concept of stocks and flows. Let us look at all these images. What are common things that we can see among these images? One thing that you can notice is that these images represent a variable or an element in the system that is capable of storing or keeping a value or an amount, and that amount is something that we are interested in understanding. We have an aquarium with water, the population of the world, a container tank, a gasoline tanker, the lake in Taal, our forest, and even our warehouse. The Hoover Dam in the US is one good example of a man-made device, or in this case, a man-made construction that is capable of keeping or impounding a large body of water, and that water is being used for many purposes. And one way to regulate that amount is to make use of flows or diversions that allows you to manage the amount of water inside Hoover Dam. So in order to understand the significance of stocks and flows, we will use a bathtub analogy, where a bathtub is something that is able to contain water, and that one way to regulate the amount of water in the bathtub depends on the faucet that feeds into the bathtub and a faucet that removes or depletes the water level in the bathtub. So we now describe the relationship between the faucet that feeds water into the bathtub as a positive relationship, and the faucet that draws water from the bathtub is a negative relationship because it brings down the level of water inside the tub. In general, we now look at the relationship between the faucets and the level of water inside the bathtub, where as you open your valve, more water flows in, and therefore more water is in the tub. As you open the output or throughput valve of your faucet, that depletes the water, which will actually bring down the water level in the bathtub. In general, when the inflow of the water into the tub and the outflow is equal, then we say that there is an equilibrium in the system, and therefore the behavior of the water level in the tub remains constant, even though there are activities happening in our system. So using the bathtub example, the tap equal to the inflow of water and the drain, which is able to control the outflow of the water, are now what we call flows. So they flow like water that flows in and out of our bathtub. And the stock is equivalent to what we call the level or the water level inside our tub. Stocks and flows are the basic elements of our systems, and we're going to use them to better understand how they play about in the behavior of your system. Other ways of looking into stock and flows would be using a capital, for example, that we have for our business, where investments increase our capital and depreciation decreases the amount of capital we have in our organization. Another example is like our money in a bank, where the amount of money inside the bank increases as interest and deposits come in, and that withdrawals are our outflows from our bank account. When we now talk about a stock is a fundamental element of a system that is responsible for generating the behavior in our system. A stock functions like a reservoir. It keeps the value and it measures the value as of that moment in time. It also accumulates over time because it is being influenced by inflows or depleted by outflows. Sometimes these stocks are also referred to as a level or an accumulator. Examples of stocks would be money in the bank or your net worth, vehicles in EDSA, your knowledge, or a forest are examples of stock. What is now the purpose of looking at our variables as stock? A stock typically has a certain value at each moment of time. The value of the stock may or may change depending on the degree of the inflows and outflows. The value of the stock at any period usually includes an accumulated value that also factors in the past. An example of a stock would be the current population of the Philippines, which as of today is around 111 million people, which is based on UN data. This data represents the number of people as of today. A second important variable when we look at our system is the flow. A flow variable is measured usually over a limited interval of time. A flow can be measured in terms of per year, per month, per quarter, per day. Flows are also called rates. And examples of these flows or rates would be like your production rate per day or the purchased by consumers per period. These rates contribute to an accumulation of inventory or say installed base or amount of customers that we have as of today. An example of a flow is usually a growth rate, or in this case, inflation. Inflation is an example of a flow or a rate and describes a percentage of the change or how much has changed from one period over the other. When flows in a system exist, these flows have an effect on our stock over time. They change the level of our stock over time. Flows are entities or things that make the stock go up and down, like a faucet that drains the level of water in the bathtub or feeds more into the bathtub. We can usually distinguish inflows when you add something and outflows when you take out something easily in many systems. Note that flows are the only variables that can influence or change our stocks. An example of a flow would be the number of new cases per day, which has exceeded 15,000 for the last 2 days, resulting to a total number of 123,000 active cases of COVID as of August 19. So why is it important to now define what we know about our system by using the concepts of stocks and flows? By knowing the stock and flows, we would expect to have a better understanding and appreciation of the mechanics that happens inside our graphs. By learning to think in terms of stocks and flows in our variables more than simply variables, it will force you to think about the nature of these variables in your causal loop. It's no longer just enough to understand that there is a possible correlation, but we wanted to understand the causation. And causation here implies that one feeds into the other or removes from the other. It will also force us to discover if we are able to overlook or maybe have overlooked certain variables that are necessary to explain some of your stock variables and its behavior in your causal loop diagram. These stocks and flows will help you get a more detailed and stronger understanding of your causal loop diagrams and why the behavior is acting that way. When we begin to see stocks in our systems, we now associate the critical behavior of your system to a stock. In systems thinking, when we look at the long or short view of our systems, we often associate that variable to a stock variable. Stock variables are capable of representing a historical performance of your system, since its values today may have been influenced by the values yesterday. An example here would be looking at an excess in our warehouse, which did not suddenly happen today, but was influenced by the decision to order in the prior period, which arrived today, and were unable to dispose of it today. Another example would be how our people do not suddenly become skilled in a day. Their skill was influenced by experience, training, coaching, and mentoring that was done to them in the previous period, leading to their capability today. So as a stock, we now take note of the level of our people's skill or the level of inventory in the warehouse as good examples of stocks. By being able to see flows, we are now looking for drivers of the behavior in our stocks. In order to determine the influencers of our system behavior, which is usually represented by a stock, it is important to account for the main drivers of our stock's behavior. These main drivers usually are the flows that happen in our system that feeds into our stock variable. Later on, by knowing these drivers or flows, we can now have an indication of where our primary points of intervention can be. A good example of understanding drivers of behavior would be like flooding in our National Capital Region. The rivers and the canals that flow through NCR are contributors or influencers to the level of flood that we will experience in NCR. These rivers and canals act as both an inflow or an outflow that feeds or drains the level of flooding in the city. Later on, when we think about how we can improve flooding, we now have to look into these flows, or rivers and canals, on how flooding can be better controlled. As a final illustration, we can also associate the concept of stocks and flows from a financial perspective. Consider the income and cash flow statements that we have in our organization. Income and cash flow statements, which contain cost of goods, CGS, expenses, etc., are considered to be flows. These statements represent financial activity during a particular period, like this year, 2021, 2019. All the other items that you have on the balance sheet, such as assets and liabilities, are considered to be stocks, and they represent the status of your organization at that point in time. By looking at these items in your balance sheet and income statement, you now begin to learn to manage the cash flow of your organization, and the cash flows are actually your rates. Looking at your organization, I would like to challenge you. Which items in the income statements act as inflows and outflows to the balance sheet performance, and how you may drive the profitability of your business and the state of your business by balancing the cash flows, the in and the out. As a key message that I'd like you to remember in this lesson, stocks and flows allow systems thinkers to have a deeper understanding of the variables being observed. It allows you to find causality more than correlation. Stocks are natural accumulators and they are best representations of the behavior of your system. And finally, the flows are the drivers and influencers of our stocks. These flows will be the basis or the clue to where interventions can be designed later on.